I'm so glad to be back with you again. And I think I was moving a little fast, thinking I didn't have that much time, but I'm going to try and slow down a bit so we can take our time with this. What I did in the first presentation was the beginning of the conflict between Samuel, Saul, Samuel, God. Now we're going to look at the intensification of the conflict, particularly in two speeches that Samuel gives. In chapter 12, his supposedly farewell speech, though he never actually leaves and goes away, never retires. He's the emeritus professor who keeps hanging around the department and causing problems, even though he's supposed to have moved on to somebody else replaced him. And then chapter 13, part of chapter 13 is a speech he makes to Saul, a speech of judgment and condemnation that then results in certain actions of Saul in chapter 14. So we're going to look at these. So if you do have your Bibles and you want to take a look at chapters 12, 13, and 14, I'll make reference to certain verses along the way. All right. So first major point, Samuel's rant about the monarchy, even after Saul is already king. That's in chapter 12. This takes place at Gilgal. And if you read the two verses in the previous chapter, Saul had just been installed as king formally at Gilgal. So this takes place right as Saul has been finally acknowledged to be king. And Samuel begins by asserting control. He takes responsibility for Saul's being king. In his opening statement, in the first verse, Samuel makes two claims that are false. At least on the surface, they're false. And Samuel said to all Israel, "Behold, Hine, I have listened to your voice in all that you have said to me." Really? "And I have installed a king over you." I've kinged a king, literally. Interesting phrase in Hebrew. Now, Samuel has not been listening to the people's voice. He's been resisting their voice. But then this opening statement comes immediately after Saul has been made king. And we read in chapter 11, verse 15, all the people went to Gilgal, and there they installed Saul as king before Yahweh in Gilgal. Using the same phrase, they kinged Saul as king. The verb related to the noun for king. So, it's a strange statement to start with. I installed Saul as king. But the narrator just told you the people did. Hint, hint. So, point 2. I'm going to adapt a quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet. A comment about Queen Gertrude. "The lady doth protest too much, methinks. Well, the prophet doth protest too much, methinks." Samuel's speech in 1 Samuel 12 is full of attention-grabbing phrases. I counted 11 of them. "Behold, Hine, and now, Ve'ata, and even now, Gamata. Behold them, Hinam. Behold me, Hine." In other words, pay attention, people. I'm talking. That's his rhetoric. The second thing about his rhetoric is it has a quasi-legal phrasing. He disputes with the people about his innocence, yet no one has accused him of anything. He's protesting immediately. "I'm innocent." Verse 3, "Here I am, Hine, testify against me before Yahweh and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I abused? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe that I might blind my eyes with it? I will return it to you." So the reference to bribes is meant to distinguish him from his sons, because in 1 Samuel 8:3, the sons were portrayed as taking bribes. That's why the people wanted a new king, because the sons were not doing well. They said, "Your sons take bribes, they pervert justice, and you're getting old, so we want a king." But the reference to not having taken, lakach, different from the taken in the lot, lakad, it's a different word, lakach, is meant to distinguish Samuel from the king. Because Samuel uses this verb take 4 times in his description of the ways or the justice of the king will take from you your sons, your daughters, your servants, your fields, take everything from you and leave you high and dry. Yet, the narrator is so nuanced under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Back in chapter 9, so Samuel said, I haven't taken anything from you, like the king will take. I'm not like the king. But in chapter 9, verse 22, the narrator adds a verb that is strictly unnecessary. It's in Hebrew. Most English translations drop the verb because it's unnecessary. This is what 1 Samuel 9:22 says. Then Samuel took Saul and his servant boy and brought them into the hall. Most translations just say Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the hall. But it says he took him and brought him. The same verb Samuel has been objecting to. He also is a taker. Now, he doesn't take the fields. He doesn't take your sons and daughters. He takes hold of Saul to control Saul. So the real purpose of Samuel's defense and his quasi-legal language is to show that there was no need for a replacement. He was doing just fine. But then he shifts from his defense in verse 3 to accusing the people of sin in verse 5, right after they absolve him for being innocent in verse 4. Verse 3, here I am, testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. And they said, you've not defrauded us or abused us, and you've not taken anything from the hand of anyone. And he said, Yahweh is witness against you, and his anointed is witness that you have not found anything in my hand. That's a strange way to put it. So, testify against me if I've done anything wrong. The moment I am absolved, I'm going to accuse you. What am I accusing you of? I'm accusing you of accusing me. But they didn't accuse him. But asking for a king is equivalent to accusing him. So Samuel moves from self-defense to accusation, and the implicit reason for the accusation is because they asked for a king. That's what this speech is all about. And from here on, it becomes very clear. Think of verse 7. And now, take your stand, and I will enter into judgment before Yahweh against you. Okay, Samuel, number 3, Samuel's confusing retelling of Israel's story. Now, Samuel's indictment of the people will begin by him telling the story of Israel. And you know, it's important to retell the story, tell that old story. Many times within the Old Testament, someone retells and summarizes the Exodus or the time of the Judges and so forth, especially the Exodus. Sometimes they go back to Abraham and so forth. Samuel seems to be modeling what he's doing on what's called the prophetic lawsuit or the covenant lawsuit. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 2, Jeremiah accuses the people of idolatry, and in chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, he summarizes the story of the Exodus, the wilderness, and the promised land entry as the basis for critiquing the people. God did all this for you, and look what you did in response. You turned aside to serve other gods. So Samuel is going to retell the story of Israel as a basis for critiquing. He summarizes the Exodus, the Judges, and the origin of the monarchy. Yet, Samuel changes all kind of details so it doesn't match what you know of the story. Is the old man just getting confused? Is he getting senile? You know, some biblical scholars say, well, he must be drawing on some alternative tradition of the story of Israel that we don't have in the Bible. No, he's changed the story. Anytime you tell a story, you can nuance the details to make the point you want to make. His point becomes very clear from how he's changed the story. He's got an agenda. So let's look at the Exodus, verses 6 through 8. And the question I want to ask is, who exactly settled Israel in the land of promise? So you know the story of Israel. Who settled Israel in the land? Call it out. Joshua. All right. Verse 8. When Jacob came into Egypt, then your ancestors cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh sent Moses and Aaron. And they brought forth your ancestors from Egypt, and they settled them in this place. Who settled the people in the place? Moses and Aaron. Why does Samuel omit Joshua's role? What is Joshua's relationship to Moses? What is Saul's relationship to Samuel? By leaving out the replacement, he's making a point. Isn't that interesting? All right, let's go to the Judges, verses 9 through 11. I have a chart. I wish I could give you. Samuel lists 4 judges. Jerubbaal, who is Gideon. Bedan, who no one's ever heard of. He doesn't occur in the book of Judges. Jephthah, who we do know of. And Samuel. He's the 4th judge. All right. There are 2 versions of the Septuagint, the Greek translation. And they're confused. They don't know who Bedan is, so they put in Barak instead. Barak was the general with Deborah, right? One of the judges. And one of the Septuagint translations is so embarrassed that Samuel would put his own name there, they changed it to Samson, who is the last judge in the book of Judges. The Targum, the Aramaic paraphrase, has Gideon, who is Jerubbaal, Samson instead of Bedan, then Jephthah and Samuel. And the Syriac translation, the Peshitta, has Deborah and Barak first, then Gideon, then Jephthah, then Samson. They can't put Samuel in there because it's too self-serving. He couldn't have actually meant himself. It must be a textual error. So they fix it. Who the heck is Bedan? Why is he there? And why has Samuel added his name to the list? Now, I want you to compare, and again, I wish I had a chart, but I'm going to try and make it real clear. I'm going to compare Samuel's implicit narrative of oppression and deliverance with what's told in the Judges. Because the Judges tells about Israel is besieged by other nations, they attack them, they call on God for help, God sends a judge and delivers them. In the book of Judges, chapters 3 through 16, you have 5 episodes of oppression and deliverance. You have Eglon, the king of Moab, attacking Israel, and God sends Ehud to bring relief. Then you have Sisera of Hazor attacking Israel. God sends Deborah and Barak to bring relief. Then the Midianites attack. God sends Gideon as a judge to bring relief. Then the Ammonites attack. God sends Jephthah as a judge to bring relief. Then the Philistines attack, and God sends Samson to bring relief. 5 episodes. What Samuel does is he lists, first of all, in order, 3 examples of oppression, and says, you call out to the Lord, and God sent judges, and then lists 4 judges. That's the way he does it. He doesn't correlate oppression to a judge and oppression. He just lists 3 oppressions and 4 judges, and in between you called out to the Lord. He has, the first oppression is Sisera of Hazor, and he lists Jerubbaal, Gideon, which doesn't match the story. He has the Philistines and Bedan, which doesn't make any sense. He has the king of Moab and Jephthah, which doesn't make any sense, if you're going in order. But whatever you deal with all that, the interesting thing is there are 3 acts of oppression and 4 judges, and the 4th judge is Samuel. What is the oppression from which Samuel is going to deliver Israel? The monarchy. It's not stated, but it's implicit. Also, when Samuel says, you called it to the Lord, if you've read the book of Judges carefully, you know that when Israel calls on the Lord for help, there is only once they ever confess their sins. It's in chapter 10, verse 10 of Judges, in the Ammonite thing. All the other times just call for help. They don't actually confess their sins, but God helps them anyway. He's that merciful. And in chapter 10, verse 10, they call out and confess their sins and say, we've served the Baals and the Ashtaroths, and God says, I don't believe him. I'm going to rescue them anyway, but I don't believe him. It's foxhole religion, basically. So Samuel quotes that episode. When they cried out to the Lord, they said, we have sinned, for we have forsaken Yahweh. We've served the Baals and the Ashtaroths. Now deliver us from the hand of our enemies, and we'll serve you. That's what Samuel says that Israel said. Why did he quote the one time when they call out to God for help? Because they have been idolatrous. Because he wants Israel to repent of the idolatry of the monarchy and ask for God to help them. And Samuel said, here am I, send me. That's implicit. Because in Samuel's eyes, we're going to see this very clearly in a moment, the monarchy is a sin equivalent to idolatry. to turning aside from the Lord. And he wants Israel to acknowledge this and call on him for deliverance, as the people did in the time of the judges. So now we get to the third episode, which was the Exodus, then the judges, now the monarchy, the origin of the monarchy. Let me read to you what Samuel says, then let me unpack it. This is verse 12. But you saw that King Nahash of the Ammonites came against you. So you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, though Yahweh your God was your king. Let's unpack that. Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you. That's chapter 11. And Saul delivers them from the Ammonite threat. But you said, no, a king shall rule over us. That's a quote from chapter 8. So instead of connecting the people's desire for a king with the Philistine threat, which is really what was going on, he connects it with the later Ammonite threat, even though Yahweh, your God, was your king. Why does he confuse events like this? I'm going to suggest it could be because the Ammonite threat was solved by Saul. He can't admit the legitimacy of that. So he connects the Ammonite threat to the people asking for a king to solve the problem, which just messes up the history. Because he cannot admit that Saul delivered Israel after he was chosen by God, anointed as king, installed as king legitimately. He can't admit that. So he mixes up the Ammonite threat with the people asking for a king. And then he adds, though Yahweh, your God, was your king. As if that's a contradiction. But Yahweh, your God, gave them a king. And didn't think it could contradict him being king, if there were certain limits on monarchy. But for Samuel, he continues to deny the legitimacy of the monarchy, thus contrasting it with God's kingship, even though God allowed the monarchy and chose the first king. All right. That's Samuel's strange retelling of the story of Israel, which doesn't match any version we know. It doesn't even match the origin of monarchy in the book of Samuel. Now let's go to point 4. Samuel's lopsided statement of covenant sanctions. The covenant sanctions, of course, are blessing and curse, right? The consequences of obedience and disobedience, loyalty and unfaithfulness. Now, it's often the case in the Old Testament that the negative consequences of an imprecation, a curse, are not actually stated, as if they're too terrible to be stated. An example is when David wants Uriah to go down to his house and wash his feet, which means have sex with his wife, so that David's adultery will be covered up when the baby is born. And Uriah says, as you live and as your soul lives, if I do this thing, ... You don't state it. If I do this thing, may I be cursed, or something like that. You don't state the consequences. It's very common in the Old Testament to leave it out. Modern translations don't know what to do with that, so they read it like, I will not do any such thing. Right? But it doesn't state the negative consequences very often. However, this contrasts with Samuel, who has a seeming inability to state the positive consequences. He's fine stating negative consequences, but he can't state the positive. All right, this is chapter 12, verse 14. If you fear Yahweh and serve him, and listen to his voice, and do not rebel against the word of his mouth, both you and the king over you, if you follow Yahweh your God, then what? Nothing. It ends. If you do all this and follow Yahweh but, verse 15, if you don't listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against his mouth, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your ancestors. Septuagint says, as it was against you, it will be against your king too. He can state that the hand of the Lord will be against you if you turn away from God. But if you serve God, he can't state a positive consequence. Why? Because he cannot believe there could be a positive consequence of Israel serving God with a king. It's impossible. He can't even articulate it. And the narrator portrays that as he's silent. If you all serve the Lord while having a king, but if you disobey, there's a blank there. 5. Samuel gets the people to admit the monarchy is evil, even after Saul has become king. Samuel causes an out-of-season storm to happen when the wheat harvest is ripe. He calls on God for this storm to convince the people that they did great evil in asking for a king. He's going to do this great thing, a storm, a great miracle, so that people will see that what they did was evil. Verse 16 and 17. Even now, Gam Atah, take your stand and see this great thing that Yahweh is doing before your eyes. Isn't it the wheat harvest today? And they say, yeah, we're ready to go reap it now. It's the season where everything is dry, the rains aren't coming, so it's perfect time to reap it. Well, I will call to the Lord, and he will thunder and send rain, and know and see that your evil is great, which you've done in the eyes of Yahweh by asking for yourselves a king. So he calls on God, and God responds to his call. Why does God respond? Because he's not going to let any of Samuel's words fall to the ground. So God said, okay, I'm committed to doing what this prophet wants, and the storm comes, which would have destroyed the wheat harvest, and it makes the people fear the Lord. But they don't only fear the Lord. Let me read you verse 18. And Samuel called to Yahweh, and Yahweh sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared Yahweh and Samuel. Yeah, I'd fear Samuel too. In fact, in chapter 12, when God sends Samuel to Jesse's household in Bethlehem to anoint a king, the people say, you come in peace, because they're scared of Samuel, because when he comes around, he does weird things, like storms that destroy crops, right? So are you coming in peace? Yeah, I am. What would be the consequences of the people? Okay, sorry, I haven't got this. Verse 19 is the next verse. The result of the storm is the people not only fear the Lord and fear Samuel, they admit they sinned in asking for a king. All the people said to Samuel, pray on behalf of your servants to Yahweh, your God. Not our God, your God. You're with God. We're kind of down here, hoi polloi, right? Pray to Yahweh, your God, so that we may not die. For we have added to all our sins the evil of asking for a king. So what would be the consequences of the people admitting asking for a king was a sin? How would that affect their loyalty to Saul going forward? It wouldn't be very pleasant, I don't think. And what effect would this admission have on Saul himself? Because remember, Saul is there with the people. This is right after he becomes installed as king. So here is Saul listening to this, and the people who he is to lead have just admitted that it's evil to have a king. But he's the king. So this is my next point now, 6. Samuel now explicitly identifies the monarchy with idolatry. He's hinted at this before. Now he gets more explicit. He uses terms for idols from the prophetic literature for Israel's sin. Verse 20 and 21. And Samuel said to the people, fear not. As for you, you've done all this evil. Yep, indeed. Do not turn aside from following Yahweh, but serve him with all your heart. And do not turn aside after empty things, tohu, which cannot profit, lo yo'ilu, and cannot deliver, for they're empty, tohu. This terms, tohu, emptiness or worthlessness, and lo yo'il, or the plural, lo yo'ilu, things which cannot profit, are found in Isaiah and Jeremiah to describe idols. Interesting. It's actually in the very same Jeremiah 2 passage I talked about, the covenant lawsuit. He uses tohu and lo yo'il. Idols are useless, empty, unprofitable things because they cannot deliver. That's very clear, especially from Isaiah. A big point that Isaiah makes. In 1 Samuel 12:21, Samuel says, don't turn aside after empty things that cannot profit and can't deliver. Idols can't deliver. Can kings deliver? Can kings save? He's suggesting they can't. They're useless. Yet, remember what God said to Samuel in chapter 9, verse 16? Tomorrow I'm going to send you a man from the tribe of Benjamin. You will anoint him, and he shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines. The king will save. And he delivered Israel from the Ammonites. So there is a disjunction in reality between idolatry and monarchy. They're not the same thing. They can become the same thing, but they're not intrinsically. Samuel thinks they are the same thing. And Samuel concludes on a positive note with an oath to pray for them and to teach them the right way. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray on your behalf. And I will instruct you in the good and straight way. So Samuel is going to do two things. Intercede on behalf of Israel, and the king is there, so on behalf of the king too, one would think, and also give them instruction in the right way to follow, what they should be doing. Teach them Torah. Here's my analogy. This is number 7. So I'll just introduce this by telling you a little bit of a story. When I got married many years ago, my father-in-law, my wife's dad, initially was opposed to the marriage because we were so young. Now, he'd been divorced 3 times. He had no real reason to think a marriage could succeed with young people. But we went ahead with the marriage anyway. We're married, it's coming up 46 years this August. Okay. We decided we weren't going to give him a speech at the wedding because we didn't think he wanted to say anything positive. But after everybody gave the speeches, he got up and said, I have something to say, and my heart sank. My wife, she had a stepsister from a previous marriage, from a later marriage with her dad, and a stepsister who was about 11 held her hand and said, hang on, Marcy, hang on. And he gave a speech, and it wasn't all bad, but it wasn't all good either. So this is my analogy. Samuel is the father of the bride. Israel is the bride. Saul is the groom. The wedding is a metaphor for the installation of the king. The father of the bride happens to also be the officiator of the wedding ceremony, in this case. And it takes place at Gilgal. And the father of the bride, who is the minister of the wedding, disapproves in no uncertain terms of the marriage of his daughter, the people, to this king, this bridegroom. So after the wedding, which he can't stop, which is meant to formalize and celebrate the relationship of bride and groom, people and king, the disgruntled minister makes a speech at the wedding, at the banquet, in which he gets the bride to admit, I've always been an exemplary father for you, right? You didn't need to replace me with a groom. She says, you're right. You've never done anything wrong. You're the perfect father. And he promises to be available at any time for marriage counseling, to teach her the right way and pray for her. No matter what problems this ill-conceived marriage may actually have, he'll be there for her the whole time. And on her wedding day, after that speech, she says, Dad, you're right. It was a bad idea to get married. That's what chapter 12 is about, if you look at it in human terms. What possible chance would there be for this marriage to succeed? And what would be the effect of this speech on the groom? That's why the subtitle of my whole book, my whole teaching is Samuel's resistance to God and the undoing of Saul. Because Saul is thrown off balance by this abuse of power. And he starts to doubt himself. We're going to see that very clearly in the next unit. Let me check how much time I have left.
You're doing great.
Okay. All right.
If you feel good, we feel good.
All right. So Samuel's condemnation of Saul in chapter 13, specifically verses 5 to 15. I'm not going to do the whole chapter. There's too much there. Which command did Saul disobey, and whose command did Saul disobey? Is the question I want to raise. So here's the context. Point 1. The Philistine troops are gathering for battle, and Saul offers a sacrifice. They're gathering for battle against Israel at Michmash, and the Israelites are running scared. They're hiding in holes and so on. Saul is in Gilgal with his troops, and they're beginning to run away, and his army is declining. And he decides to offer sacrifices, the very sacrifices, the 2 that Samuel suggested he was going to offer back in chapter 10. Wait for me 7 days and I'll come and offer burnt offering and a sacrifice of fellowship or communion. And he gets to offer the first one, the burnt offering, which is a symbol of total dedication to the Lord. As you burn everything, you don't eat any of it, it goes totally to the Lord. So we're told, Saul is at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal. The people began to slip away from Saul, so he said, "Bring the burnt offering to me and the offerings of well-being." And he offered the burnt offering. At that moment, Samuel arrives. Aha! What have you done? That's his immediate condemnation of Saul. You know, I sometimes try to model this in class. I come to class and say, "Everybody ready for the quiz?" "Oh, quiz? What quiz?" Yeah, I made that up, right? Throw them off balance. "What have you done? You've sinned." Saul replied, "When I saw the people were slipping away from me, and you didn't come within the days appointed, and the Philistines were mustering at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down upon me at Gilgal, and I'm not entreated the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself, and I offered the burnt offering." This is what Samuel says. "You have acted foolishly, for you have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you." The saying it twice make it stronger. And then a few verses later, "You have not kept what Yahweh commanded you." Made it very clear you have broken a command of the Lord. Well, which command was this? Some commentators suggest that maybe only priests could offer sacrifices. That's been shown to be not true at all in the Bible. Not at all true. Others suggest that Samuel disobeyed Saul's instruction for him to wait 7 days at Gilgal so he could come and offer the sacrifices. The narrator said Saul waited the 7 appointed days and Samuel didn't come. Plus, this instruction to wait was Samuel's instruction. It wasn't God's instruction. But, you know, the Lord doesn't allow Samuel's words to fall to the ground. But it doesn't come from God. It's Samuel's instruction. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann puts it this way. Samuel cites no commandment that has been broken, nor can we construe one. The commandment that seems to have been broken is, "Thou shalt not violate Samuel's authority." The consequences for Saul, number 4. His kingdom will not continue. Samuel declares the ending of Saul's dynasty. Verses 13 and 14. "The Lord would have established your kingdom forever, but now your kingdom will not continue." Most commentators think, and I agree, that this probably means that Saul will continue to be king, but he will not have a dynasty, so Jonathan will not be king. A new dynasty will replace him. So is this really a word from the Lord? Or is this just Samuel's word that God now is committed to support? But more importantly, does Samuel assume automatically that anything he says is a word from the Lord? No religious leader believes that, does he? Ha, ha, ha. A lot of people in the church believe that. They come to the point where they cannot distinguish their own authority from God's. That's very dangerous. I've had friends who've been in churches like that, and they've had to leave for their own mental health. So however we answer that question, right, it's clear that Samuel's words have immense power to bless or to curse, because the narrator indicated that God would support the word of the prophet. Samuel then, in verse 14, makes an additional comment, which it feels extemporaneous to me. So he said, "The Lord would have established your kingdom forever, but now your kingdom will not continue." The Lord has already chosen somebody to replace you. Extemporaneous comment. He's sought a man after his own heart, and he's appointed him to be ruler over the people. Well, has he? God doesn't actually reject Saul from being king till chapter 15. And Samuel doesn't even know who the replacement is. In chapter 16, when Samuel goes to Bethlehem to look at the sons of Jesse, Eliab, the oldest, comes before him and he says, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." And God said, "No, I haven't chosen this one. Don't anoint any till I tell you." That is the first time God stops Samuel in his tracks. And he says, all right, now you've gone far enough. You messed up Saul. I'm not going to have you mess up anybody else. I'm not going to let you do anything you want. So stop. Your word now is not going to happen. You see, if God was supporting every word of Samuel, still, and Samuel said, Eliab, that's the one. Then God would say, okay, that's the one. But God said, no, that's not the one. I don't want this one. Wait on me. So interesting. So even if Samuel's instructions and condemnation of Saul did not originate with God, Saul takes the words as coming from God because he cannot distinguish God from the prophet. Yahweh is Samuel's God. And there are serious consequences for taking Samuel's words as the word of the Lord here. Because what he does next is he overcompensates for having done something wrong, though he's not quite sure what it is, by trying to show he's very stringent in obeying God, in totally being dedicated to the Lord. And that's the fallout for Jonathan. There's a battle for the Philistines going on. Jonathan has a daring plan. He's going to take his armor bearer and they're going to go up a hill. They're going to attack the Philistine garrison. They do. It causes 20 people to die, and there's a chaos going on, and there's panic in the camp. And Saul sends his soldiers saying, what's going on up there? Let's go fight them too. And he goes to fight. He doesn't even know Jonathan was there. And the Philistines are routed. And then, this is point 2 now. Saul makes a rash oath. He lays an oath on the troops to fast until the battle is over, in verse 24. Now the men of Israel were hard pressed that day, and Saul laid an oath on the troops, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food before it is evening, and I have been avenged on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. Jonathan, unknowingly, because he wasn't around, breaks the oath. The troops came upon a honeycomb, and the honey was dripping out, and the troops didn't touch it because they had feared the oath. But Jonathan hadn't known of it, so he took some on the tip of his staff, put it in his mouth, and his eyes brightened. And the soldier said, your father strictly charged us, saying, cursed is anyone who eats food this day, but the troops are faint. And Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. Look how my eyes brightened by eating a little bit of honey. How much better if the troops had eaten today from the spoil they took from the enemies. Then the victory would have been even greater over the Philistines. But because you guys are weak right now. Then there's a consequence of this. That's point 3. The troops are so hungry that they pounce upon the spoil and eat it with the blood in it, contravening Levitical law. Don't eat the food of the blood. It actually contravenes even the Noahic law. And it was reported to Saul. Look, the troops are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood. And Saul brings resolution to this by saying, let's bring the spoil, slaughter the animals properly, drain out the blood, and you can eat now. But the troops have gone against Torah because of Saul's rash oath. But worse than that, there's another consequence. Point 4. They make an inquiry from the ephod, Saul and his priest, but God doesn't respond. And Saul figures out that there's been a problem. So now they cast lots. And this is a real casting of lots to find out who sinned. And Jonathan and Saul were set against all the people, and the lot fell on Jonathan and Saul. Then the lot fell between Jonathan and Saul and Jonathan. And Jonathan admitted, yep, I did taste some honey with the tip of my staff. Here I am. I'm ready to die. And Saul says, God, do so to me and more also. That's a phrase you find in Samuel a lot. Do so to me and more also. We're not quite sure what it means. It's like an oath. You shall surely die, Jonathan. No, it's pretty clear from the Torah that you can ransom somebody from death if you want. But he is so overcompensating for having failed in some way, he doesn't think he can actually do that. So the troops have to say, look, Jonathan accomplished this great victory for us. Not a hair of his head will perish today. And the troops ransom Jonathan. Thank God. So, what's the upshot of 1 Samuel 14? It looks to me like Samuel's condemnation of Saul, which is an unjustified condemnation. The narrator makes that clear. Saul waited the 7 days, and we don't know what else he was disobeying besides that. This condemnation triggered Saul's overcompensation to prove his dedication to God. And that led to the troops breaking Levitical law and nearly leads to the death of his own son. What are we to think about Samuel's use of the prophetic office to speak words of condemnation to the people in chapter 12, getting them to admit their sin after the king has been installed, and speaking words of condemnation to Saul, throwing him totally off balance, so that he becomes unbalanced later on? Does Samuel actually speak a word from God? In the end, he speaks a word of God, because God supports his word, but I don't think it's from God. What sort of prophet is he? Prophets in the Bible do two things. They bring the word from the Lord to the people. It's either a word of judgment or of salvation. And when it's the word of judgment, many of the prophets, not all, Moses does it, Jeremiah does it, a number of minor prophets do it too. They turn back to God and say, Lord, give them time to repent. Hold off the judgment. They intercede for the people. Forgive them. Israel is so small, says Amos. How can they suffer like this? Be merciful. Or in Habakkuk, in your wrath show mercy. But Samuel is a prophet who only brings judgment, never oracles of salvation, and never intercedes on behalf of the people. Though he swore an oath that he would never cease praying for them, we're going to see that there is nowhere from that point on that he ever does pray for them. The only time he prays is that the Lord brings a storm and destroy the crops. So a prophet should stand on the side of the Lord to bring the word, but a prophet should also stand on the side of the people to say, be merciful to them. A prophet has to be in both camps, and a true Christian leader has to be in both camps. But Samuel is only in one camp. He is identified with the Lord, so much so that he brings only judgment upon the people and upon Saul.